My name's Matt Aspbury, and I'm the director of photography on Pixar SOUL, and you're listening to the Go Creative Show.
Hello and welcome to the Go Creative Show, a podcast for filmmakers. My name is Ben Consoli, and today's guest is Matt Aspbury. He's the director of photography for Disney Pixar's Soul on Disney Plus right now. Matt, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here.
Great. It's great to be here. Thank you.
Now, we have a ton to talk about with Matt, but I just want to take a quick moment and tell you about our sponsor, MZ. I want to thank those guys, Education for Creatives. Check them out at mz.com. And of course, follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. We're doing a lot of exclusive YouTube content, so make sure you subscribe there. And while you're in the mood for subscribing, please subscribe to Go Creative Show on your favorite podcast app so you never miss an episode. So, Matt, I loved Soul. I mean, every Pixar movie is just awesome no matter what. Uh-huh. But my God, how great of a film. This is just fantastic.
Yeah, no, I mean, leave it to Pete Docter to just, really, he just comes up with such creative ideas. Each one's just kind of pushing new bounds. And this one, just the amount of challenges, both technically and visually in it, as well as just the storyline. Yeah, we just loved it. I mean, it was just such a fun movie to work on.
Now, I want to know, a lot of people don't necessarily associate animation with cinematography in a way.
Right.
You kind of think of them as two separate entities. Talk to me about what a cinematographer's role is in an animation, like, Soul.
Yeah, so it is divided between myself and another artist on each film it is. And so I'm on the front end, which is basically, we call it in the studio, we call it layout, which is essentially the term or the name it's had since early days of Disney and, just 2D animation going way back. So we're basically the ones who are essentially the cinematographers or the camera people who translate the storyboards into the 3D environment, using kind of the principles of film language and just, everything that a live action film, cinematographer would consider. And so basically, we're kind of that initial stage because everything up until our department was, just 2D drawn storyboards in a story reel for years. Sometimes they're working on these things for years before it comes to us. And so we're really that first, time to figure out the timing of things, the camera movement, the kind of choreography, just what the characters, are actually doing in the scene, how they're blocked. So we're responsible for all of that, and then we're doing it in a rough form because we know it's going to be animated after us. But even though the lighting, DP who comes much later down the road, even though we're separated by months, really, that kind of time period has actually collapsed in the last few films. And it used to be, lighting wouldn't really start until much later on, after things were well into animation or later. And now we have just each film is, really getting closer and closer, and we're really collaborating a lot more. So Ian and I worked closely on that.
So you're planning your shots as a director of photography, but you're not able to light. The lighting comes after. That's interesting to me because, directors of photography in, I guess, traditional film, lighting is it.
Yeah, it is. That said, though, we actually have a very rough lighting preview, and actually Ian, in the lighting DP on this film, was actually giving us kind of very temp lighting, as we were doing our shots. So we would kind of do these location scout shots basically in our software, which is called Presto, and then I would hand that to him, and he would basically then go in and he loved it because it was a very early preview for to get his head around what the lighting would be ultimately when it did come to his group. And so again we do have shadows now. But when I first got to Pixar, we didn't have any of that. Lighting was really much later. And we worked on WALL-E with Roger Deakins. He consulted on that film.
Oh, wow.
And that was the very first thing he said when he, got there is he was shocked at how divorced the two parts of the process were. And he just said, 50-60% of his job was lighting. And he just couldn't imagine not having that in there. And so, right around that film is when we first started to they started to really work on it. But it was very separate for a long time.
So what are you actually working with? So like you get on set, you're ready to do your work for the day.
Yeah.
Are you using virtual cameras? How are you conducting the filmmaking?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's all taking place within our software, which is Presto, and it's for people who aren't that familiar with. I mean, there's third-party programs out there like Maya and 3D Studio Max, and a lot of different other packages that studios use. Presto is essentially kind of, just our own in-house version of that. But yes, you do have a camera in there, and we have a lens package in there, and then depth of field preview, and you can put your camera on a dolly track and on a crane rig, all within this 3D environment. That said, we do have another process which we use as well, which is we can actually go into a 3D capture volume. And we have a few of them at the studio, and you can actually sit there with an iPad and actually move around in the space, and you have screens around you kind of showing you, what you're actually seeing. And some directors really like that approach. We also use that particular approach for later on when we're doing camera polish to mimic better the feel of and movements of a live action camera.
Yeah, and I noticed that in this film in particular, it really felt like someone was operating in a way. You know what I mean? It felt like that.
Yeah, and we wanted that. Actually, that was, since we had two worlds basically to shoot in this film, we really wanted them to feel distinct. And not only do they look, they look very different. Obviously, the Soul world is very, everything's made up of these volumes and kind of very soft, ethereal. And so, and then the lighting treatment, everything's different. For New York, we wanted it to feel like it was handheld and just to, first of all, to reflect the kind of overall chaos of it. And then to make it feel like somebody, that was just a texture that we wanted in there to really contrast it against the Soul world. And the Soul world, if you look at it, it's very elegant, kind of weightless. We wanted a feeling of weightlessness on the cameras there to feel like they weren't necessarily obeying the laws of physics or, just how a camera, and we do have some handheld stuff in the Soul world, depending on the sequence, but that was really important to us. Also because the textures are so, almost photoreal in some cases in the New York scene. So I think of the barbershop in particular, it's gorgeous. And so we really felt like just having those little micro adjusts and operations with the characters really helped kind of root it in that, that world visually.
Tell me about your approach to New York. How were you capturing? What was your goal for your interpretation of New York in Soul? We were basically, this was the first Pete Docter film that actually was shot in 239. His other films, Monsters Incorporated, Up and Inside Out, were all 185. So for one thing, he just made the decision early on this show that he did want to do 239, and so we were looking at a lot of films. Some of our favorite films that were shot. A lot of them were shot in the 70s and 60s using 239 format, anamorphic actually. So we use an anamorphic lens package on our New York camera, and basically to really have very shallow depth of field. And we favored a lot of long lenses on it. Some of it was just done to really compress the space. We really liked what that was doing visually, but also to kind of organize it too. There was just so much back there. And, as I'm sure you're aware, in animation too, just, you can't just go out on a street and shoot crowds in the background. You actually have to put those all there. And so, and then if there's too much back there, we were worried that it was just going to be hard to really focus on, our characters, because it's really about Joe and 22. So, it was done both aesthetically as well as just practically. So, we could really doff out a lot of the background characters and cars and traffic and all that stuff. And you got a sense of it back there, but you weren't seeing it in vivid, crisp detail. Yeah.
So.
How much of the scene was complete when it was time to actually apply cameras and lenses and all of that to it?
Oh, so basically the way we work is, again, we're the one in our department, the layout department. None of it is. Really, it's just storyboard form to us. So we went in, on the average sequence, something like the barbershop or even this chase in the subway, we actually have to kind of previs that out essentially. And again, in layout we do rough character blocking, but we have to know what the rough speed of a character running through the streets is or a subway in order to have your camera accurately film that. And so, we actually get things really tight. I mean, we're then basically working with the editorial department. The real difference between live action and animation is in animation, since it's so expensive and labor intensive, you basically are shooting and editing your film up front. And so you don't want it going into animation and then you're figuring out, oh, well, we're going to cut this, or you want to know exactly what the lengths of each shot, is. And you just want to know exactly what that timing is. And so as opposed to getting into shooting a whole bunch of stuff, getting into the editing room like you do in live action, and then you're kind of making your movie in the editing room sometimes. We have to do that months and months ahead of time. So basically it's on us to really put all of that blocking and to kind of anticipate. And once it goes to the animation department, they'll deviate from it sometimes, but largely it stays pretty close to what we've worked out. And we're constantly chasing, as soon as they decide, oh, actually this character would move a lot faster through the scene, or oftentimes it's a lot slower than we think. Then we have to go back in and kind of adjust those cameras and massage them and get it to look more in sync with what they're putting in there.
Are you working with essentially like wireframe type of level?
No. I mean, this is all very, very fleshed out. Years ago, I mean, back in the early days of Pixar, it wasn't even wireframe, but it was, characters in T-poses. Sometimes they didn't even have eyes. I mean, just basic. They were chess pieces essentially that you were moving around. And when you go back and look at that stuff now, and it wasn't just Pixar, it was just, it was amazing that you even knew what you had back at that stage because it was so rough. And now if you look at it, I mean, layout is getting to the point where it's practically, roughly animated. Again, the animators bring incredible work to it. So we're not even approaching what they're doing, but it is, we have run cycles on there, and the characters, they don't have all the nice shading that you see in the final renders of the film, but they look like the characters, and they have hair and clothes and all of the simulation on their clothes now we're even seeing in layout. So wow. Whereas several films ago, we were using basically naked characters sometimes, just because it was just faster, and you just didn't want to deal with that at the layout stage. Yeah.
What is the biggest challenge for you working in animation as a cinematographer?
I mean, I'd say it varies film to film, honestly. I mean, it's just, each film kind of dictates, what you're going to bring to it and what you want to do with it. And we,
what about in this film?
In this film, I mean, by far our greatest challenge on this film was the fact that it felt like we were making two separate movies the whole time, because the worlds were so different, and the treatments of them, and the soul world in particular was so hard because all of that stuff that you see in the final film, in terms of just the volumes, the ethereal quality to it, even the grass, that you see in the youth seminar, we didn't really have a good preview of that at the layout stage. We were guessing a lot of the time. So the amount of iterating we had to do when those sequences and shots went into animation was much more so than the New York. The New York stuff, honestly, was very straightforward by comparison. So, it was just the challenge of all that, just dealing with it. And again, kind of guessing while you were, and it was hard, to show those sequences to the director too, Pete, because it was such a leap of faith. We had some maybe still frame renders of, okay, it's going to look like this, but you were, it wasn't until many months after the fact that it really started to come together in the soul world sequences.
Are you involved in the look of these environments at all, other than running the cinematography of it? Like, we talk to so many directors of photography that
Yes.
are talking about visual references they bring.
Yes, absolutely.
How does that process go?
I mean, basically, we had this great little group that it was meeting a couple, I'd say, depending on where we were in the production, but it was every couple of weeks we would get together, myself and Ian, the lighting DP, as well as Kevin Nolting, the editor, and then Steve Pilcher is the production designer, and then Pete Doctor, basically. And we would just meet and all talk about, as each sequence was nearing production, which was basically moving into our department, we would talk about just ideas that we wanted to kind of hit on aesthetically as well as cinematically. And so we were kind of all lining up on it. And we, through that, we were also kind of creating almost like a lookbook of just different films we were referencing, or just different looks. Honestly, for the jazz stuff, we were looking at photos of Roy DeCarava and just some of these beautiful black and white. We also had Bradford Young was consulting on the film.
Oh, wow.
So he was, and he was honestly mostly dealing with, helping out Ian's group, because he was having a lot of input on the lighting of the film. But he was tremendous. I mean, just getting to talk to him and hear, just how he approached things, and in terms of lenses used, and he would say the same thing, that it was very different depending on the film he was on, and as well as the director he was paired with. And so, but anyway, that small group that we had assembled, it was just so great because then by the time sequences were entering production, it felt like we had kind of talked through a lot of stuff, and there weren't any huge surprises.
MZ is the perfect place to hone your creative skills. And it's never been a better time. On MZ, you have hundreds of hours of high-quality video-based filmmaking education covering all sorts of topics that we all need to know: directing, cinematography, post-production, visual storytelling, and more. And of course, the education's only as valuable as its teacher, right? If you don't have good educators, then you don't really get to learn the same way. But that's not the case at MZ, because they have high-quality educators. I'm talking about Vincent Laforet, Shane Hurlbut, Philip Bloom. They have Tom Cross. He's the editor of La La Land and Whiplash, doing a whole course on the art and technique of film editing. So they've got really high-profile people that are doing just fantastic, amazing work. And it doesn't end there. There are hundreds of hours of content there on MZ. And if you become an MZ Pro member, you get access to everything on the site. And yes, you can buy individual courses, but that MZ Pro membership is exactly what we here at Go Creative Show really need. And I've got good news for you. You get 20% off your purchase by using GCS20 at checkout. GCS20 for 20% off. So check it out for yourself. GoCreativeshow.com/MZ, MZED. We've got a question from one of our Instagram followers about your visual approach in the hyper-realistic look of New York. Renato Groberman is asking about that. And I think it's a great question, because there is something, it's so realistic, this New York.
Yes.
It's almost that, it's like that next level realism.
Yes, I know. But I mean, a lot of that comes out, honestly, in the shading, the set shading. And I think that's what you're probably talking about. I mean, so in terms of, we have a whole other department that is basically constructing all of these assets, such as basically we have a whole department that deals with all the characters, and then we have a department that deals with all the sets and the kind of, non-animating elements. And, a lot of that realism, I think, comes through the shading that they apply to those objects. And honestly, it's a really tough thing too, because you're kind of on these two parallel paths where the characters are being designed, and then you have this other group that's designing the sets. And, you want to make sure that they're both kind of being designed in tandem. Maybe, in terms of the textures that you're applying to those buildings, you don't want them to feel so photoreal that then you stick this character in there and it looks completely out of place. So it's really tricky in that regard, but I feel like they did a good job on this. I mean, the characters, you're never going to mistake any of these characters for real human beings, both in the way they move as well as just their stylization. But at the same time, they feel rooted in that environment. And I think you feel grounded, and hopefully you're not distracted and saying, wow, that looks like a fake character, person standing in a photoreal set.
Well, I think that's always the struggle. Animation, like I think the Holy Grail, or at least I thought the Holy Grail was to have animation look as realistic as possible, but it seems like the Holy Grail is really having characters that fit the environment and have it just feel right.
Yeah, I mean, because there's all levels of that. There's very. I think it's just kind of deciding on a vision very early on and making sure that everything then holds up to that, and not having things the environments either be too realistic or the characters the other way around. And it's really hard, I think, and a lot of it depends on the pipeline that you've got set up at the studio, that. All those shaders that have been written and everything, and then, and then our lighting materials that basically are reacting to those shaders. But Ian could give you more info on that particular aspect of it. But for sure, in New York, he was going for a very naturalistic lighting scheme, and especially you look at those scenes in the jazz club. Again, I think about his Lipa's tailor shop, as well as the even his apartment. I mean, you see that stuff, and then I think all of those things. Again, hopefully it's not feeling to the degree that it's photoreal, and you're just thinking that that they just photographed a real set or something. I think it's got a stylization.
It is, and I think it helps you draw into the characters too. I want to talk with you about the way you approach filming human characters, representations of humans in the New York world, and then how you treat shooting characters that are clearly not human in the Soul world, because are you changing your cinematography techniques to reflect kind of what we expect as audiences for humans versus kind of supernatural characters?
I mean, to a degree, some of it goes back to that having a more handheld, organic feel for the New York stuff to feel more reactive. I mean, we had the added challenge in Soul and the New York stuff. We have a 6'4" guy, Joe, and then a cat for that whole part of the movie. And, and we've had other movies where we have these massive size discrepancies, and to get the two of them in a frame, without having him always crouched over or the cat up on something, so that it was a real challenge. I mean, in some of those shots in his apartment, we just had to be very wide to hold them both. So, I would say that was a big consideration. On the flip side, the souls were actually, there's a couple shots in the film, but mainly one where they get kind of Terry sucks them back into the soul world in that whole subway chase. You can actually see the souls then leaving the bodies of Joe and the cat. And so those souls were basically we had a metric, and I don't know who came up with it. They said that they're only 2 apples high, basically. And, they had to fit inside the chest, essentially. But up on the soul world, we were dealing with much smaller scales of everything, even though you would never know because you don't have any frame of reference up there for what a human size is, except when they go into that whole Hall of You, which is when Joe is looking at all of these flashbacks of his life.
Yeah.
That was a challenge, basically, for us to kind of because that was the only time we really see the souls next to the human-sized characters, and that was just that dictated how far our camera had to be away, what type of lenses we used, and stuff.
I was thinking about that size discrepancy and saying to myself, like, they didn't have a real actor. They could have done whatever they wanted. Why?
I know.
Why did you challenge yourself with that crazy size discrepancy?
I know. I mean, it was just, it was one of those things that a decision gets made early on and everybody holds hands. And it's not until you get, months later when it's in layout and everybody's going, oh, but we dealt with it. And it was actually fine. I think there were some other films we've done where it was even, a bigger challenge. But, so, in terms of the approach on the New York stuff, I'd say is more reactive, basically. And then one more thing on the Soul world. Now I just thought of it. We tended to have faster cutting in the New York stuff. It was more visceral, just kind of faster paced scenes. Up in the Soul world, we actually had these very long kind of master shots. So we had stuff that was basically in the boards. It was, 12 or 14 shots and storyboards. We combined a lot of those into one single moving master, essentially, and combo shot.
I'm glad you mentioned that because, yes, there's a shift in this character. Like, our main character changes over time, and the way that you experience the soul world is slow, calm. You're really taking it all in.
Yes.
The way you experience New York is frenetic and crazy.
Yes.
But we're noticing that our main character, as he's realizing what his purpose really is and what that means, he's starting to experience New York the way that he experienced Soul. And there's something very specific about that, and I really felt that change.
That's great.
Can you talk to me about the choices that were made to give the audience that feel, to actually appreciate New York and not be so frenetic?
Yeah, I mean, well, that's the interesting thing is that basically it took 22, being inside of his body to kind of, for him to all of a sudden look and realize everything he was just taking for granted or glossing over in his daily life. And, that shot that whole sequence where they basically go to, wait outside the jazz club for Moonwind to show up. And that's when she sees the seed pod fall down and she gets these, beautiful little kind of romantic vistas, a father with his child and these women at a cafe and these leaves kind of. So, all of those kind of cameras are very graceful and kind of poetic in there. And the lighting in there is just this beautiful, dappled lighting through the trees. Obviously, the colors, it's fall in New York City as well. So we really wanted to make that distinct. I mean, because obviously when 22 first ends up in his body, it is this, harried, frantic thing where we wanted it to just be the sensory visual overload. I mean, in New York, I think all of us feel that anytime you go to New York. I mean, it's just, you're bombarded. And so we really wanted that, here's somebody who's never even been in a body or never been on Earth before. And now all of a sudden she's in a 6'4" guy's body and in the middle of a busy street. And so we definitely tried to really contrast those two moments.
One of the big stories with Soul is the representation of Black characters and having so many of them. Yeah. Talk to me about why that's important. And is this something that Pixar is thinking about doing more of, as far as you know?
I mean, Pete would probably be the better person to ask on that. I mean, honestly, by the time myself and Ian came on as the DPs, the story had pretty much been decided and figured out in that regard. But yeah, absolutely. I think, I'd say that the studio is for sure wanting to just diversify. I mean, I worked on Coco as well, and that was a big deal, that film. And, same for that film, we went down to Mexico a few times on research trips and everything. So this movie was, they really wanted it to be authentic and feel, just telling New York, especially from an African-American's point of view in New York City. Kemp, who was the co-director on it and the writer, he obviously lent a huge amount of authenticity to that. But in terms of it being, so when I think about what the studio right now has in production, it does seem to be where, just branching out and trying more diverse stories. But, I think overall, it's just the story has to be there first, and then, everybody has to be excited about what they're seeing. I don't think that we're not just making films because they're diverse, and I think, it's really still, the goal is to tell the best story possible.
Well, the film is absolutely beautiful. If you guys haven't seen it, I strongly suggest you do. It's on Disney Plus right now. It's called Soul. Excellent work. Really beautiful job, Matt. And we'd love to have you back for your next project. I wish we had time to talk about Coco, which I was also obsessed with.
Yeah, I know. No, thanks so much for having me. And thank you for supporting the film.
A huge thank you to Matt Aspbury for coming on the show and talking about his experience working on Soul. If you guys haven't seen it, please go check it out. You're going to absolutely love it. It's on Disney Plus right now. I want to thank our producer, Connor Crosby, for putting the whole show together behind the scenes, making it great. You can find him at ignitionvisuals.com. And of course, I want to thank Dave Siegel for mixing, mastering, and making the show sound so good. You can find him at siegelsound.com and on Instagram, Siegel Sound. There you go. And while you're on the Instagram, you should check us out, Go Creative Show. We put a lot of content up there as well, and we give you the opportunity to have your questions heard on the show. So that's a good place to follow us, as well as Facebook and Twitter, and of course, YouTube. We're doing a ton of exclusive content just for our YouTube subscribers. So head over to YouTube, find us, click subscribe, and the notification bell, of course, so you can always be abreast of what's going on in Go Creative Show world. And of course, subscribe to us on your favorite podcast app. I want to thank MZ Education for Creatives for sponsoring the show. And of course, all of you guys out there for listening and watching and sharing. Thank you so much for supporting the Go Creative Show. And we'll see you next week on another episode of Go Creative Show, a podcast for filmmakers.